This week's Dark Side of the Ring episode covered the career of Matt Bourne, aka the original Doink the Clown. Yet another story of a wrestler hooked on booze and drugs. Stop me if you've heard this before. Who fucked up their entire career over it. He was his own worst enemy, and in the case of Bourne, really didn't seem to have many redeeming qualities. But he made a great evil Doink, and he should have been bigger in that role than he ended up being, but he's got nobody to blame for that but himself. Chris Jericho being the narrator for this was appropriate, given that he once dressed up as Doink on an episode of Raw. This was before his Wrestlemania match with William Regal. Mick Foley was interviewed for this. He was a big fan of Bourne's work, and he patterned himself after him. He was a big influence on his career. Brian Blair was interviewed, Tom Pritchard, Hacksaw Jim Duggan, two of Matt's ex-wives, and his daughter Tegan, who is convinced of her father being murdered, which flies in the face of what the police said. So we're going to talk about all of that. But Bourne was a second-generation star. For those who don't know, he was the son of Tough Tony Borne out of the Portland territory. And if you were looking for a lot of information about Matt's home life as a young man, we don't get a lot of that here in this episode. Outside of the mention of his parents splitting when he was 10 years old, he went to go live with his father because, as his ex-wife tells it, Matt once shared with her what his mother said: "You go live with your dad because I don't want that little bastard." And she said that stuck with Matt for the rest of his life. And that's the only mention of his mother for the entire episode. Matt actually wrestled Ricky Steamboat at the very first WrestleMania back in 1985. He was there long before he ever portrayed Doink. But before that, he found success pretty much everywhere he went. He was an excellent worker. There's a lot of similarities between him and Buzz Sawyer in that, in the two of them, you had two very flawed human beings, but nobody, even the ones who knew them and said they were scumbags, have ever said anything bad about their work in the ring. They were always very complimentary of Buzz Sawyer, always very complimentary of Matt Bourne. Funny enough, Buzz Sawyer and Matt Bourne were a tag team. They were partners for a while in different territories. They ended up at a big fight one day on the side of the road because they just couldn't stand each other anymore. But his team with Buzz was never mentioned in the episode. Brian Blair, he told a wild story on the show, which I've heard Arn Anderson talk about before on his podcast, where he met Bourne at the hotel bar one night. And he didn't really know Matt. I think he may have been new. Brian may have been new, but Matt comes up to him. So they didn't even meet per se. It's just Matt comes up to him and asks him, "Hey, why are you messing with my girl?" And Blair had no idea what he was talking about. And he figured he was just trying to act tough, for the boys. And Bourne just suddenly blasts him from behind. And they start fighting, and they got pulled apart probably 2 or 3 times. And Matt just kept coming back after him. And Blair figures he was all coked up or something because he just didn't seem human. At one point, Bourne opens his mouth up like he's going to bite Blair's nose off. And Blair instead bites Bourne's bottom lip, and he rips it off and spits it out on the ground. And Bourne just kept coming back to the point where Bourne was reaching down. At one point with his fingers, he was trying to fish around for Blair's eye. He was going to try to gouge his eye out. More eyeball gouging. We heard a lot about that on the Tales from the Territory show. Every episode, there was some new story about somebody's eyeball coming out. And I'm sure most of them were not true. Thankfully, Ivan Koloff was there for this, and he kicked Bourne's hand away from him before he could do any damage, and he just starts yelling, "No eyes! No eyes!" Arn said the same thing on his show when he told that story. He said Koloff was yelling, "No eyes! No eyes!" And Blair said, "Look, I guess if you have the right drugs in you, they can make you superhuman." Because this guy just kept coming back and he wouldn't stop. Hacksaw Jim Duggan was also interviewed for this, and he was very blunt and said Matt was a bully. I mean, you got to be a real jerk to get Hacksaw, of all people, to come on here and speak ill of the dead. He and Bourne and Ted DiBiase, they were a heel trio in Mid-South called the Rat Pack. And not the chicken shit type heels. They were a group of ass-kicking heels. Until one fateful night in Monroe, Louisiana, Duggan got punched by a fan as they were leaving the ring. So he socked the guy right back. At that point, the fan fell to the ground, so he's on the floor now. He's probably on all fours. And Matt Borne is behind Duggan as they're leaving, and he now sees the fan on the ground, and he decides to give this guy a good kick. Well, in kicking him, Duggan says he broke the guy's orbital bone. And Bourne's ex-wife, Michelle, says that he told her, "Oh, I kicked that guy so hard his eyeball fell out." And we got the reenactment of a guy on all fours getting kicked in the head, and you literally see his eyeball hanging out of his skull. I'm telling you, they love their eyeballs, man. They love telling those eyeball stories. Duggan says the fan sued him, the fan sued Matt, and the fan sued Mid-South over the incident. Borne lost his job over it. And in Bourne's own words, years ago, he appeared on the Boston Wrestling YouTube channel. He did an interview with, he was in studio with Dan Murad, or Muradi, the late Dan Muradi. Dan's the one who would often have wrestlers in studio for shoot interviews. He did a lot of interviews with Tony Atlas until they had a falling out. Marty Jannetty made a few appearances. He would always have John Cena's father, John Cena Sr., was often on the show because he was part of the whole independent wrestling scene in Boston. Cena's father might still be doing managing on the independent scene in Boston. But anyway, Dan passed away last year. But Borne was on his show a few years ago, several years ago, and said that when he got back to the locker room that night, Bill Watts grabbed him and gave him a big ol' hug. He said he was treated like a hero for what he did, until the fallout came with the lawsuit. And Watts lost his license to promote in Monroe for about a year. Cost him a lot of money. It cost Duggan, he said, $30,000 in the lawsuit. All of a sudden, he became public enemy number one. It was actually $25,000 that the fan was awarded that Duggan was on the hook for fracturing the guy's eye socket with that punch. I was curious, so I looked up the lawsuit. There was no mention of anything that Borne did in there. There was no mention of Matt Bourne or Matt Osborne or anything like that. There was no mention of anybody losing an eye. It did say, I'll just read the quote that I lifted here from the suit. But it said, among the crowd were Donald Sills, his wife, and her 17-year-old brother, Victor Caldwell, who was about 6'1", 135 pounds. Sills, who describes himself as a little short fat boy, is 5'9", 240 pounds, 40 years old, a wrestling fan who was not an athlete. Sills was not seated next to the aisle in which Hacksaw and his teammate were each being escorted to the dressing room by a policeman, but was 4 or 5 seats away from the aisle. A rolled-up cup of ice thrown by a fan in the vicinity of Sills hit Hacksaw in the face or head as he was being escorted down the aisle. Believing that young Caldwell threw the cup of ice, Hacksaw pointed at Caldwell, exclaiming, "There's the little SOB." Hacksaw moved chairs and advanced towards Caldwell and Sills from several feet away. Young Caldwell was pushed backwards, whereupon Sills, who even Hacksaw said, assumed a defensive posture with his arms raised. The trial court found that Sills, with his arms near his body, raised his hands with his palms straight out near his head and stated, "Don't hit the kid." Hacksaw then struck Sills with his fist, fracturing the orbital floor of Sills' eye socket and knocking Sills to the floor. So that was the end of the Rat Pack. Borne ended up in WWE. He got fired within a year due to his drug use. And for you to get fired back then in WWE for drug use in the mid-'80s, you had to be a hardcore user. Because I'm sure the drug use was rampant in that locker room. To get fired for it, you know this dude had to have a very bad drug problem. His ex-wife said that she doesn't think Matt ever wrestled sober. Think about that. Think how scary that is. You got these men in there putting their trust in their opponents when they climb into the ring, and the fact that this guy was almost never sober when he did so is an alarming thing for her to say. And he was a great worker. So he was able to manage it, I guess. But her saying that he was always high, he was never sober. You know, he had a cocaine habit. His cocaine habit was just out of control. Cocaine was a big thing back then. That wasn't the only incident with Borne that Duggan has talked about. Another one Duggan talked about in his book that was not documented in the episode, but I think it does speak to a pattern of behavior when it comes to him putting his hands on women. He said in his book, "It started in late 1982, as we were heading into Baton Rouge, spending the night there before a show the following evening. Borne had a girlfriend, and while we were all in a bar, they got into an argument, and the next thing I know, he's slapping this girl around. Duggan said he pulled the girl away from Borne and took her out of the bar, put her in his car to take her home. Borne followed Duggan out of the bar, was furious, started spitting on his car. Duggan ignored it, he drove her home. The next day at the show, Borne started yelling at Duggan and tried to leg dive him, not realizing that Duggan was actually a better amateur than he was. He didn't realize that. Duggan said that he threw Borne down. He was putting the boots to him when Ernie Ladd, the booker at the time, jumped in to stop it. Duggan went back to the dressing room, and Borne slammed open the door and told him this isn't over yet. So they started fighting again. The only person there was Ted DiBiase, who decided against breaking it up. A wise move, I would say. A wise move. Keep your nose out of it, or you might get your nose bitten off. There was another incident 27 years after the fact, and they did cover this in the episode. They even had the footage of their infamous match in 2010 from an independent show in White Plains, New York. And there's maybe 100 people there. Duggan is not doing anything crazy in his matches on the indies, at his age at that point. I mean, he never did anything crazy in the ring in his prime, let alone on the indies when he's 56 years old. But here's, Matt Bourne, and he cuts a promo on Duggan, running him down. Duggan has no idea what's going on. Bourne hits him with a nut shot, for real, which Duggan no-sells. Matt grabs a chair, so Duggan grabs his 2x4. As ridiculous as this sounds. These old men, one's got a chair, the other one's got, I'll grab my 2x4. It's like two crazy men in an old folks' home. But Duggan, he grabbed his 2x4 because he knows how wackadoo this guy is. He doesn't know if he's going to shoot on him for real or not. He's going to protect himself. He told Matt, look, if you want to settle this, let's take it to the back like men and we'll handle our business there. Matt never did fight him in the back, though. Duggan was there waiting for him. But Bourne had packed all of his shit in his car before the match started, and he left through a fire exit. He didn't even go backstage into the locker room. He left through an emergency exit, got in his car, and he drove off. And Foley laughed and he said, you have to work really hard to not like Hacksaw Jim Duggan. But in all of these stories, Bourne comes off, just as Duggan said earlier, like a complete bully. At least in that Boston wrestling shoot, he admitted that he was wrong for kicking that fan in the head at the show in Mid-South. The man was already down on the ground and he kicked him in the face as hard as he could anyway. He could have killed him. He admitted that it was wrong of him to do that. So at least he had some self-awareness about that situation. Either that or who knows? Maybe he was just trying to make himself look good. Who knows what's going through some people's heads? But he got hired by WCW doing a lumberjack gimmick as Big Josh. So they were playing off his roots in Portland wrestling as a lumberjack. And we met his first ex-wife at this point in the episode, Maria, who was only married to him from 1991 to 1993. She said that he seemed like a nice guy when she met him. I'm sure they all do. She said they had a daughter together. He barely made it back in time for her birth, even though he was high and he was a little drunk. He did make it. He got offered another chance by Vince McMahon, and this is where Doink the Clown was born. No pun intended. Tom Pritchard thought that it made perfect sense, since the Road Warriors, Road Warrior Hawk once called Bourne Krusty the Clown. He had seen him sitting in the locker room. His hair was all messed up. He was sitting there smoking cigarettes. So he was like a real-life Krusty the Clown. So it's fitting that Vince wanted to turn him into a real-life clown. She says that it was his favorite character. And, when you first hear the idea, you think, oh, this is a terrible idea. What a burial for this guy. He's a very good worker. Now they're going to have him in clown makeup and a green wig. This has got to be a rib, right? What a disgraceful thing. But I gained a greater appreciation for the character as the years have gone on, and I go back and I watch Evil Doink. The babyface Doinks that came later, Doink and Dink, That fucking sucked. Okay? All of that shit fucking sucked. Evil Doink, though, was so good. From the creepy heel music to the way he would be laughing maniacally 1 second, then he would stop and look in the camera, and he would just like stop on a dime and just stare into the camera. The way he would make animal balloons for the little kids on his way to the ring, and then he would pop them or he would squirt them in the face with water from the flower, pin on his jacket, make them cry. And then the bell would ring, and the guy could actually wrestle. He could tie you up in knots. And then he'd come off the top with the whoopee cushion. And he was doing that move long before he was Doink. Just didn't start calling it the whoopee cushion until he became a clown. And you'd have Bobby Heenan on commentary. He used to tease that this man, boy, this guy looks awfully familiar, Monsoon. I know this guy. But he could never put his finger on exactly who it was. It was brilliant. And I'm not sure anybody but Matt Bourne could have played that character as well as he did. Which is why it's a shame it only lasted a few months. And think about this. Matt Bourne spent less than a year as Doink on television and was never pushed as a headliner when he was Doink. He was always a mid-card act at a time when wrestling was probably at its least popular, business-wise. And yet here we are 30 years later still talking about Doink the Clown. People don't talk about Maniac Matt Bourne. They don't talk about the Rat Pack. They don't talk about Big Josh. They talk about Doink. And when he died, Doink the Clown was in the top 10 most searched items on the internet. That's crazy. They aired clips of the double Doink stuff from his match with Crush at WrestleMania 9, where they had Steve Keirn playing a second Doink who came out from under the ring to help him win. And then we find out here that Bourne didn't like that. He felt that it was Vince McMahon setting him up for failure. I always liked the finish. I thought it was pretty clever the way they did that. They did something similar a few months later at the King of the Ring at the end of the Crush Shawn Michaels match. The reason he didn't like it was because WWE wanted the angle at WrestleMania to build to a Doink tag team. And he did not want to do that. He thought it was a bad idea. He was also paranoid, that Keirn was trying to take the gimmick away from him. I mean, I doubt that was the case. But that's why apparently he... And this they didn't mention in the episode, but in doing some research, apparently that was really the reason why he was not enamored with, having other people dress up as Doink. I guess in his mind, it made him more easily replaceable. Which, I guess he was proven right. He was proven right after he got fired, and that's exactly what happened. They just had other people in the makeup and the costume. I mean... The person's wearing makeup on his face and a full body costume with a green wig. So, there are certain body types that wouldn't work. It would be obvious it's not, the original Doink, but honestly, you could put almost anybody under there and nobody would really know the difference. Years ago, Borne claimed that originally it was supposed to be Doink against Hulk Hogan at WrestleMania that year from Caesar's Palace. But it didn't happen because Hogan didn't want to work with him. If Hogan nixed it, if he nixed the idea, I don't really blame Hogan. Although I think it absolutely could have worked as like a one-off program, I can't blame Hogan. At the time, Hogan had been off television for a year. He was making his big comeback at WrestleMania that year. And you're going to put him in the ring with a guy in a clown costume? A guy in a clown costume who's only been on television at that point for what, three or 4 months by that point? He hadn't been around very long. If that's true, I can't say that I blame Hogan for being hesitant. But that's assuming the story is even true, and I have a hard time believing that story is true. Hogan against Doink as a championship match could have worked, but not a WrestleMania. King of the Ring that year actually would have been a fine place to do it because it was the Bret Hart show anyway. They wouldn't have had to headline the pay-per-view with it. They could just do what they did with Hogan and Yokozuna. I mean, it was in the middle of the show. Of course, Hogan would have won, but Hogan ended up not sticking around. But a short program between the two with Doink, terrorizing all the little, Hulkamaniacs, could have been fun, right? Have him be a real sinister SOB. All the people who scoff at the idea, oh, please, like it never could have worked. There's a reason the Joker is the best Batman villain. creepy guy in the clown makeup who deep down is just some tortured soul. He's got a villain origin story that we just don't know about. I mean, that might have been a little too sophisticated for 1993 WWE, but as a one-off match, I think it would have been fine. But the man was a ticking time bomb. He would disappear for days at a time without telling his wife where he was. He ended up getting fired for failing a drug test. His wife at the time said that he started getting angrier and drinking more and doing more coke. He also became more physically abusive to her and to their daughter. He would throw lit cigarettes at her. He threw her down one time while she had their baby in her arms. And the baby couldn't have been more than a few months old at that point. That was enough for her. That was the line in the sand. She took her daughter and she left and she never looked back. After that, he went on an 8-day coke binge. He started hallucinating. WWE kept the Doink gimmick going with other people, which, again, was not difficult given that, the face paint and the full body costume, you could hide who it was. Steve Kern had been let go, so it was mostly Ray Apollo. And sometimes Steve Lombardi, the Brooklyn Brawler, would also play Doink, but it was never the same. Doink stuck around for a while after Borne got fired, but it just was never the same. It would have been very interesting to see how Borne would have played Doink as a babyface, because they were already heading in that direction. So whether or not he could have made it work, we'll never know. They were already in the process of turning Doink babyface. Some people may not realize that, but after SummerSlam in '93, they were doing angles on TV where Jerry Lawler blamed Doink for him losing his match with Bret Hart, because Doink wrestled Bret first at SummerSlam, and then Lawler, basically there were 2 Bret matches that night, but Doink lost to Bret Hart. So Lawler was blaming him for that, and Doink threw a bucket of water on Lawler on one episode of The King's Court. I think he threw either water or a pie or something at Bobby Heenan. So it was getting over well when his drug problems led to him missing an overseas tour, right as things were starting to heat up, and then they eventually let him go. His ex-wife, Michelle, came across a little bit in this episode to me like an enabler, always making excuses for him. She said that he got her good one time. After accusing her of cheating on him, he beat the crap out of her. So badly that he put her in the hospital with 2 black eyes that were swollen shut for 2 weeks. She couldn't see out of either eye. She looked like a monster. She says that he came to the hospital, he saw her laying there, he had no idea what happened to her. Didn't even remember that he was the one who put her there in the first place, and he's apologizing to her for it. Any man who uses his wife or his girlfriend or any woman as a punching bag like that is a piece of shit. They touched on the Borne Again gimmick that he did in ECW, where he wore half the Doink makeup on his face and he wrestled as this psychotic heel. He would dress up his opponents as Doink. He'd put the Doink, wig and not really a mask, but I mean, it's like a headpiece. He would put the Doink hair on his opponents after their matches. It could have been something special, but he blew it. Depending on the version of events that you believe, he blew it. Matt himself has claimed that he was offered money to do some big European tour, and that Paul Heyman gave him his blessing to go do it, but then when he got back a month later, Heyman ghosted him and never returned his calls. Others have said that his drug problems were getting even worse. It made him a bitch to deal with. That version I can believe. Based on his history, that's the version of events I tend to believe. That's the reason he was let go by WWE and ended up in ECW in the first place. He got fired because of his drug problems. He blew many chances in his career because of his drug problems, so you can add the Borne Again stuff in ECW to the list. Vince McMahon was not happy about him still using the gimmick on Indies, and I guess maybe in ECW. He sent him a cease and desist. Matt was very unhappy because he never got paid, he claimed, any residuals on any of the Doink merch that WWE sold. The action figures, the video games he was in, none of it. So they reached an agreement where he would get his residuals and he would have to stop using the Doink gimmick. I know he continued to use the Doink gimmick on the Indies for many, many years after that. So I'm not sure if he just ignored that or exactly what the explanation would be. Maybe he just didn't give a shit. Maybe indie shows were okay as long as it wasn't on TV and ECW was on TV. I don't know. But right up until his death, he would still don the Doink outfit and wrestle. They introduced us to a woman named Connie Cook who played a nurse character who would hit people with a bedpan outside the ring. She was Matt's girlfriend for a while. She said they were both crazy, and they hit it off, which sounds like a recipe for disaster. He found her on Facebook, apparently, in 2011, and that's how they met. She moved to Texas with him, and he helped take care of her mother, who was sick at the time. And then in June of 2013, Tegan, Matt's daughter, says that she got a text message from her mom saying, "I think your dad is dead," which is one hell of a text message to get from your mother. She, the mother, had seen a story about this on TMZ. And indeed, he did die. He was only 55 years old. The cause of death was determined to be an accidental overdose of morphine and hydrocodone. And he also had an enlarged heart, as many wrestlers do, especially from that era. But his heart was 6 times the normal size that it should be, 710 grams. And the manner of death listed in the toxicology report was accident. Matt's daughter doesn't buy that. She says that's bullshit. She thinks that Connie killed her father. She said, "She took him away from me and I hate her for it." This took a turn here at this point in the episode that I was not expecting. Now, Connie maintains that Matt, who again was helping look after her mom, stole all of her mom's drugs. Probably not a good idea in the first place to give a drug addict access to all of these opiates just sitting around this woman's house. That sounds like a bad decision. You're just tempting fate by doing that. Tegan and Michelle both claim that Matt called them the night before he died and said that he was leaving Connie. And Michelle claims that he told her, "If anything happens to me, don't let it go. Whatever happens, don't let it go." Okay, so this is what they claim. Connie's version of events is that Matt started moaning in the kitchen. He fell to his knee, but then he asked her to marry him. She said that she thought he was having a heart attack and he just didn't want to tell her. So she found his glasses later on by her mom's pills, and she noticed one of the pill bottles was moved, and these were drugs from her hospice care. Her mom was, obviously very sick, and so that's what all the drugs were from. She told Matt, "You need to let me know where those pills are. Tell me where those pills are." And Matt told her, "Look, if I do, I'm going to end up going to jail." And then she ends up having to drag Matt off the floor and into the bed that night, and she thought that he was fine at that point. Now, according to the police report, at 6:30 the following morning, Connie said that she heard gurgling sounds coming from Matt, and she figured that he was just snoring. A few minutes later, she saw foam coming out of his nose and his mouth, and she got concerned, so she called a friend in Tennessee. She didn't call 911. She phoned a friend, like she's on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. "Hey, Regis, I think I'll call Pamela in Tennessee to ask her if my boyfriend is dying or not." So then she takes the phone receiver and she holds the phone up so the friend can listen to the gurgling noises and I guess give her a diagnosis. The friend immediately tells her, "Call 911, like a normal fucking person would." But as this woman herself said, she was crazy. She said it herself earlier in the episode. We were crazy. We gravitated towards each other. That's what crazy people do. Crazy people do crazy things, like call their friend instead of calling the paramedics. So they say that she then went back to bed and didn't call 911 until 9 a.m. Now, this all happened at 6:30. The police report states that she contacted 911 at 0900 hours. Connie claims, "Nope, that's wrong. That's wrong. I didn't go back to bed. As soon as I hung up with my friend, I called 911. Why the police report would say one thing and she would say another, and that's a pretty big discrepancy. I mean, look, that's a 2.5 hour difference. That we don't know. She says the detective came. They noted that there were about 30 pills missing from the bottle. Michelle and Tegan thinks that she's full of shit. She let him die. Tegan specifically thinks that Connie slipped something into her father's drink and then left him on the recliner to die. There is no evidence to support anything other than she may have been grossly negligent in how quickly she called 911 or didn't. once she realized something was wrong, but the police didn't find any evidence to actually charge this woman with a crime. I assume the 0900 hours thing for the 911 call, they have a record of that sort of thing. So that is very suspect to me. Why there would have been such a big gap between her waking up and seeing the gurgling and the foam and calling the friend and then finally calling 911. That and the fact that earlier she thought she may have been... Remember what she said in the episode? I thought he was having a heart attack and he just wasn't telling me. And again, she did nothing. If you think this person is having a heart attack, why would you do nothing? All of these things are happening. Why are you not calling for medical attention right away? So I can completely understand why the daughter would think that this woman killed her father, either directly or indirectly. But it also sounds to me like a grieving daughter reaching for any explanation that isn't really there for what happened to her father. Her father was a drug addict. Hardcore. He abused his body with booze and drugs for years, for decades. He had heart issues on top of that. It is not hard to fathom that those issues would end up killing him at an early age. It's sad, but when you do the things that Matt Bourne was doing for years and years, you are not going to live to a ripe old age. There are freak, examples in this world. You look at Keith Richards. You look at Jake the Snake Roberts, okay? I can't explain it, so don't ask me. I think even Jake would tell you he's very lucky to be alive with all the shit that he put into his body over the years. Some people are just luckier than others. Or have better genetics, I guess. But there have been dozens and dozens and dozens of wrestlers who were not as lucky. A lot of wrestlers who did not even make it as long as Matt Bourne did. Tegan said that she graduated with a 4.0 GPA. She's a certified public accountant now. She showed off the tattoo, big tattoo of her dad's face that's on her arm. And she said he wasn't perfect, but he was my dad. It is depressing to see all of these stories of wrestlers living hard the way that they did and the kids they left behind in their wake. We see it time and time again on these episodes, and even something like the Owen Hart story, which was a completely different circumstance. But he still left behind 2 little kids that barely got a chance to know him. It's just really sad. Matt's life, especially after he was fired from WWE during the Doink run, was just one sad situation after another. This wasn't in the episode, but he was living in a trailer at one point, just doing drugs all the time. He was arrested multiple times for vandalism, for public intoxication, trespassing, disorderly conduct, all sorts of things. In 1999, he had his parole revoked for testing positive for cocaine. He spent time in jail for that. After that, he drifted from place to place. He was living out of his car at one point, and it bothered him that he was estranged from a lot of his kids. I believe he had 4 of them. On a Facebook post 3 weeks before he passed away, he said Father's Day was coming up and he would be seeing his dad soon. His dad had already passed away. And he also said that his children are the most important people in his life, and being estranged from them is sometimes more than I could handle. Not looking for sympathy, just cherish your children and their lives. They did not cover the famous Buddy Rose story that they did document on the Tales from the Territories episode on Portland Wrestling. So if you didn't see the episode or listen to the review, Buddy Rose and Matt Bourne, they had a great on-screen rivalry in Portland that ended up being an off-screen rivalry as well. He came on television one day, Buddy Rose did, and he said the Playboy was no more. Playboy Buddy Rose is dead. He was going to settle down. He was getting married. And the woman he was marrying was Toni Ray Bourne, who was Matt Bourne's sister. And this was a shoot, and the marriage did not last long. Some people even thought maybe they never really were married. It was all for show. But they were really married. And the story is either, and I've heard different versions of this, but the story is either that Buddy beat her up or he cheated on her. It may have been both. But in any event, the two got into an argument at home. Buddy starts smacking her around. She manages to get to the phone. She calls her brother. Matt rushes over to the house in a rage. He kicks down the front door. He beats the shit out of Buddy. Buddy literally runs out of the house to try to get away from this guy. Bourne tackles him down in the front yard. When the police got there, Matt was still beating on him. After that, Don Owen, the promoter in Portland, forced the two of them to work together because everybody knew the story and he knew they could make money off of it, and they did. They did big business on top. So I was surprised they didn't mention any of this. I mean, to me, that's a great story for television if I've ever heard one. The other story they didn't mention was the reason Matt left the Georgia territory. And again, I understand that don't necessarily have time for all of these stories because they only have about a 43-minute window to work with here. But the other story they didn't mention was the reason Matt left Georgia. The Wild Samoans, Afa and Sika, they had left Georgia to head to the WWF. And in the process, they vacated their NWA national tag team titles. So Ole Anderson had no tag team champions. And his plan was to put Arn Anderson and Matt Bourne together as a team to succeed them and win the titles. I don't think Arn and Matt tagged for very long. It may have literally been a month or two. But Matt fucked it all up. He was impossible to work with because of his drug problems and the alcohol problems. Arn has straight up called the man an asshole. Right? So then Bourne gets arrested for sexual assault on the daughter of the woman that he was, I guess, with at the time. I don't know if it was some sort of violent assault or it may have been a case where he was caught sleeping with the girl and she was underage, which happened quite a bit back then in wrestling. Whatever the age of consent in Georgia was at the time. I looked it up now. It's 16 in Georgia. Let's assume it was 16 then. So the girl would have been 14 or 15 at the time. He gets busted. It got press. And he had to leave the territory. And as Arn tells it, he found out about it when Ole called him into his office one day and told him, word for word, asshole Matt really fucked you, didn't he? Yeah. Yes, he did. And so his plans for them as this big tag team champions, just went up in smoke. And it screwed over Arn for a time. But historically, what it also did, and the reason I think, again, this is a great story that they could have weaved in here, was it caused Ole to go out in search of a new heel tag team, and it led to him meeting with Eddie Sharkey in Minneapolis, who told him, hey, I got these two big power lifters that I'm training right now who I think would be great. And those two power lifters turned out to be Hawk and Animal, the Road Warriors. And the rest is history. So I think him getting hit with a sex assault charge, and then what it ended up leading to, is something that would have been worth bringing up, even if they had to trim the fat from somewhere else in this episode. I also think, after the Plane Ride from Hell episode last season, there are probably issues getting certain people to agree to be interviewed for this show. Because as we saw with Tommy Dreamer in that episode, for example, you may open your mouth and end up causing yourself more grief than it's worth. And I do wonder if they've run into problems getting more talking heads for these episodes. When the episode was over, though, and again, I'm listening to the family talking about what a good person Matt was, I'm sorry, it's hard to reconcile that with the 40 minutes that I just sat through, basically telling us the exact opposite. Calling him a bully, and a drug abuser, and a wife beater. Oh, but he's a good person. I think the best way to describe it is that life is not always black and white. There are shades of gray. Maybe he turned his life around at the end, maybe he didn't. I don't know, but Matt Bourne was a troubled soul who people have very mixed feelings about, depending on what their experiences were like with him. Very good worker, but a very flawed human being, more than most, would be the polite way for me to say it.